everyone, welcome back to Beyond Nihility. In this video, we're going to try to create our own watercolor brush. So this brush will be created by changing a couple of settings based on what we have learned so far in our videos. That is, we have learned about shape, we have learned about grain, how to change your texture of your brush, how to set them to different rendering modes, and how to create that watercolor wet effect using the wet mix. If you haven't watched all of those videos, I'll leave a card on the screen where it's a playlist containing all the different important attributes explained in Procreate in detail. So I would recommend for you to go check it out before we begin this one. But if you're someone who just wants to create this brush and do not bother much about what each of the settings are, then continue watching this video till the end. So I already have the brush created over here. It's kind of smooth in texture but gives that really nice watery effect. So in order to get to the brush settings interface, I'm just going to click on the brush that I already have. So as you can see, we have two brushes over here. So I did try to create this watercolor brush using just one brush, but again, it was really hard for me to create with just one brush. So I thought of combining two different brushes so that the secondary brush will kind of act like a filter before the stroke is laid on the canvas. So coming to the primary brush first, I have tapered both at the beginning at the end. The size of the taper is set to 95% and the opacity is set to 29% and the pressure is set to max. And if you want to understand what each of these properties are under taper, then again I do recommend you to watch the detailed video I've made on taper and shape on my channel. With that being said, let's continue. I do not have any changes that I've done on touch taper as I'll be mostly using my pencil to draw. But if you're someone who wants to kind of draw with your fingers instead of using the pencil, then I would recommend you to set the same set of values for touch taper as well. I think the only difference is the pressure, because in Procreate the pressure is kind of dependent on how much pressure you put with your pencil on the canvas, and that cannot be achieved with your fingers. So except for that particular settings, I think most of the other settings are same, so you can just replicate the same settings for your touch taper as well. Coming to the next defining attribute that we have, which is shape. So here, as you can see, I do have a shape imported from the source library itself. It's called Waterbleed. So you can just select that one and probably click on done. Your shape will be imported in the shape editor. And the input style here is set to azimuth. Next, coming to the touch properties, the rotation which is given under the touch properties won't really matter much because it will only come into picture when you selected the input style to touch only. That is if you want to draw a drawing using your fingers and not the pencil. Next, coming to the shape properties, I've not set any scatter. Coming to count, I've set it to 5. So if I've set the value to 5, it means that I want my stamp to be stamped 5 times at one single point. But one thing which you need to keep in mind is the more you increase the count, the more harsh it is on your iPad's performance. So I tend to keep count at lower values. Now coming to shape filtering, I have set it to no filtering here because I do not want the strokes to be too smooth. I do want them to be little edgy, so it gives that really raw look. Coming to grain, you have the grain source itself. Now this is really important. You have to choose the texture which is kind of similar to a watercolor paper or a watercolor canvas. So the one that I've chosen was again present in the source library itself. If you go to the source library, there are several options over here, but the ones that I would probably prefer is stain paper 1 and stain paper 2. The one that I've used in this particular brush is stain paper 1. So once you select this, you can click on done. Again, all these features have been explained in the video that I've created earlier. So if you want more details on that, then you can check out the video. I'll leave the card in the screen. Now, moving on, the grain behavior, I've set it to texturized and I've set the scale to 17%. So this will help you determine how big or how large your texture should be under your brush stroke. So I've set the scale to 17% over here, and then depth is something that will help you determine how visible your texture should be. So I've set it to 87%, and brightness, I've not touched my brightness, it's at 0%, but the contrast of the grain, I've reduced it to minus 38%. Coming to grain filtering, again I've set it to no filtering, and 3 3D grain here, this doesn't really matter much unless I'm painting on a 3D model or something. Having this toggle on will help you create the grain if your camera moves on a 3D model. Next we have rendering. So rendering here I've set it to uniform blending, but if you're someone who wants to create this particular brush just by using one brush, then I would recommend setting your rendering mode using the glaze. Next you have blending, and here you have something called as flow, which will help you determine how much paint should come through your pencil. Next you have wet edges. You can set the wet edges to max. Next you have burnt edges. So this will apply color burn to your edges. I've set the burnt edges value to 49%. Next you have burnt edges mode, which is set to multiply, and the blend mode I've set it to lighter color. Moving on, we have wet mix. So wet mix is a very significant attribute if you're trying to create a watercolor brush. This will contain settings which will control how much pigment should come, how much water should be there in your brush strokes. So the first one under wet mix which you have is dilution. So dilution will control how much water should be there in your paint. So I've set the dilution percentage to 35%. So charge I've set it to 61%, and attack I've set it to 40%. Next you have pull, which will help you bring that effect of the paint being pulled across your brush strokes when laid on the canvas. So I've set the pull to maximum. And then grade is something that kind of brings the contrast. So I've set the grade to 85%. Next you have blur. It kind of gives that blurry effect that you're able to see over here. So I've set the blur percentage to 51%. So if you want that maximum randomness, I would recommend setting the blur jitter to higher values. Next you have wetness jitter. So this will basically work if you have some amount of dilution set. It'll just bring the randomness towards the amount of water. The higher the wetness jitter, the more randomness there will be. Since I have some dilution set over here, I've set the wetness jitter to 81%. Next you have color dynamics, where I've not varied much. Coming to dynamics as well, there's nothing set over here. Now when you come to Apple Pencil, you do have an option to set the opacity. I would recommend setting the opacity to maximum as well as the bleed to maximum. This will give that nice watercolor effect when you draw a stroke in the canvas. Coming to properties, these are just the default properties that are set. I have not really varied much over here. So those were all the attributes that I've set for my primary. I think I did forget the stroke path, which is kind of important. I don't know why did I forget that. However, so you have something called a stroke path where you can determine how much spacing you want between each of your stamp, how much randomness you want on how they are placed in your stroke, and there's something called as fall off, which will kind of give that faded effect to your brush. So these are the values that I've set for each of them. That is, spacing is set to 16%, jitter is set to 18%, and fall off is set to 9%. So those were all the settings that I've set for my primary brush. Now coming to the secondary brush that we have, which will again act like a filter before your paint is laid on the canvas. So one thing that you need to make sure is not to go too crazy with your secondary brush, because it can make the brush strokes look a lot clumsier if you have too much going on. All we want is a subtle filter just so the paint is laid out nicely on the canvas. So let's go ahead and see what are the settings for the secondary brush. First thing is the stroke path itself, wherein the spacing, jitter and fall off are set to these values. Spacing is set to 4%, jitter is set to 57%, and fall off is set to 9%. Next you have stabilization. So these don't really matter much. They just define how stabilized your stroke should be. Even if you turn them off, it's not really that big of an issue. So you can probably just turn all of them off. Next you have taper. Taper, I do not have it set for my secondary brush because, as I said, I've already set it for my primary brush, and that is what matters the most. Next you have shape. So for shape, I went with the simple shape that was in the shape source library in the Procreate. So if you probably search for blotch, you get different types of blotch stamps over here. So the one that I chose is simple blotch, which is blotch 1. So once you click on it, you can just click on done to import the shape source. And then again, input style, I've set it to azimuth, and there's nothing set in the touch properties or the shape properties over here because I have all these properties already set for my primary brush. And coming to grain, I do not have any grain over here. It's just a blank grain. You can see that there's no grain over here. Since we do not have any grain, you need not worry much about what has been set over here. You can just turn all of them off. Coming to rendering, here I've set it to intense glaze. Next you have blending, where I've set the flow to maximum. Next I have opacity under Apple Pencil, which I've set it to max, and bleed to max. And apart from this, the properties and all these values are just default values. I've not changed much around them. So these are all the settings that I've set for my secondary brush. Now there's one more thing that you have to take care of before you finish off this brush, is how your primary brush and secondary brush should interact with each other. So if you see here, there is something called as combine mode, which again contains different blending modes. So you can check which one suits you best. For me, hard mix is something that gave me the desired result. So I've set the combine mode to hard mix. And once all of this is done, you can probably go to about this brush and probably change the name of the brush over here and probably add your signature if you've created by yourself. So those are all the settings that I have for both my primary and secondary brush. Once everything is done, I'll just click on done, and there should be a watercolor brush that should be created in your brush library. Now to see how this particular brush works like, probably we'll take a new layer and then try to draw something and also try to blend them. And this is how my brush looks like. It's really watery. The pigment is more at the beginning, and as and when you drag towards your canvas, the pigment is kind of becoming more watery. Now the reason it's behaving like this is because we modified few settings under wet mix. As I told, it's very significant for your watercolor brushes. So you can try and test them out once you have created the brush. The colors are blending really nice, and this can be a great tool for blending your watercolor paint that is laid on the canvas. So keep experimenting with it, and if you want, you can tweak around with few more settings to get the desired result. Now if you want this particular brush, then it's totally free. You can download it using the link in the description. There's also another brush that I created previously, which is the crumbled gold foil brush. If you want that as well, I'll leave the link to that as well in the description. These are totally free, and all you have to do is just keep supporting me so I can make more free brushes for you guys as a token of thank you. So with that being said, if you made it this far into the video, thanks a lot for your support, and I'll see you in the next coming videos. Until then, take care and bye bye.